And there was a shot, and Paul was dead.
Inger Stevens seemed to have everything a person could want in 1970s Hollywood. She was beautiful, famous, and had a successful acting career that most people in the entertainment industry could only dream about. But on a spring morning in 1970, everything changed. She was found dead in her home at just 35 years old. The authorities quickly decided she had taken her own life, and the newspapers moved on to other stories. However, the whispers and questions never really went away. Her friends always hinted that there were dangerous secrets in her life that the public never knew about. There were documents that were never released to the public, pointing to a hidden life that she desperately tried to keep away from the cameras and reporters. At the center of all these secrets was a marriage that nobody in Hollywood dared to talk about openly at that time. It was an interracial marriage, and in that era, such a relationship could destroy a person's career overnight. For many years, the real truth about what happened to Inger Stevens was buried under rumors, gossip, and deliberate silence. But now, after decades of secrecy, some long-lost evidence and voices from people who knew her personally are finally coming forward. What they reveal is a disturbing new version of what really happened in her final days. This new information might completely change everything we thought we knew about Inger Stevens and how she died. By the standards of 1960s Hollywood, Inger Stevens appeared to be the perfect example of innocence and availability. The studios wanted the public to see her as single, glamorous, and ready for those controlled romantic relationships that kept the fan magazines busy and profitable. But this public image was completely fake. Away from the cameras and the public eye, Inger had already made a choice that could have completely destroyed her career in an instant, if anyone had found out. She had secretly married Ike Jones, who was an African-American actor and producer. During that time period, interracial relationships were not just considered shocking or inappropriate by many people. They were sometimes even considered dangerous. This wasn't just a personal decision that affected her private life. It was a professional gamble with incredibly high stakes that she couldn't even acknowledge publicly without risking everything she had worked for. The marriage was kept completely hidden from the press and the public. It existed in a world of shadows, with discreet meetings, coded phone calls, and trusted friends who were sworn to absolute silence about what they knew. The people who did know about the marriage said it wasn't just about love, although love was certainly part of it. It was also an act of defiance against the system. Inger had seen the hypocrisy of Hollywood's image-making machine, and she refused to let that system dictate what her heart could feel or whom she could love. But that defiance came with a terrible cost. She and Ike couldn't be photographed together in public. They couldn't attend events as a married couple. If a reporter started asking too many questions about their relationship, they would have to abruptly leave town to avoid suspicion. The constant need for secrecy took a serious toll on both of them. Friends remembered late-night conversations where Inger admitted she felt trapped, not by her marriage itself, but by the overwhelming need to hide it from everyone. Every interview she gave was like walking through a minefield. Every meeting with studio executives was another performance where she had to pretend to be the unattached leading lady that producers wanted her to be. This constant acting and lying was exhausting and emotionally draining. Adding to all this stress, her career began to slow down and stall. The roles that had once come easily to her started going to younger actresses instead. Studio executives grew impatient with her, and although she never spoke publicly about the pressure she was feeling, the people close to her noticed that she was becoming more and more exhausted. The marriage that gave her personal happiness and fulfillment was also a constant reminder of what she couldn't have: a normal, open life where she could be honest about who she was and whom she loved. This tension and stress began to affect every aspect of her life, creating cracks in the carefully constructed armor she had built around herself to protect her secret. By the late 1960s, Inger Stevens was walking on a tightrope, and that wire was beginning to fray dangerously. The steady stream of leading roles that had once defined her career had slowed to just a trickle. The movie studios were shifting their attention and their money to a new generation of stars, and the woman who had once been television's golden girl was suddenly facing a much less glamorous reality. To the public, she still appeared to be the charming actress with the perfect smile that they had always known. But behind closed doors, her world was getting smaller and more difficult every day. The secret marriage to Ike Jones was still firmly hidden from public view, but it was becoming harder and harder to maintain that secrecy. Gossip columnists had begun sniffing around for stories, and in Hollywood, even the faintest hint of scandal could be completely fatal to a person's career. Her friends began to notice a change in her personality and behavior. She seemed distracted and quick to become irritated, and at times she appeared deeply withdrawn from the people around her. She started taking on projects that didn't match her earlier ambitions and talent level. Perhaps she did this to stay visible in the industry, or perhaps these lower quality offers were all she had left to choose from. When she was working on movie sets, her professionalism never faltered, and she always did her job well. But her inner light seemed dimmer than it used to be, and the joy seemed to have gone out of her work. Isolation became her constant companion. With Ike, their life together was like trying to solve a puzzle of hidden moments and secret meetings. With her colleagues and other people in the industry, she had to play the part of the carefree single woman. This constant pretending was emotionally exhausting, and she felt like the walls were closing in on her from all sides. Then came what should have been a turning point in her career. She was offered a film role that should have been her big comeback, her chance to prove that she was still a major star. But the tensions behind the scenes of that production, coupled with a grueling and demanding production schedule, left her completely drained. Rumors began to spread throughout Hollywood that she was difficult to work with, which was a label that could kill a career even faster than a scandal could. Privately, she began expressing fears that someone might expose her marriage to the public. The thought of this terrified her, not because she felt any personal shame about her relationship, but because she knew that the backlash from the industry and the public would be absolutely merciless. She was already trying to balance on the edge of a cliff. One more serious blow could send her falling over the edge, and there might be no way back up. The cracks in her life were no longer small, hairline fractures that could be hidden or ignored. They were spreading fast and becoming more obvious to the people around her. Soon, a series of events would push her life into a downward spiral from which there would be no return, no matter how hard she tried to regain control. Inger Stevens's last year alive was like a slow-burning fuse on a bomb. At first, the problems were quiet and manageable, but then they became impossible to ignore. On the surface, she still tried to maintain her public image as best she could. She attended select events when she had to, gave carefully scripted interviews to reporters, and smiled for the cameras whenever they were pointed in her direction. But behind that polished exterior that everyone saw, both her personal life and her professional world were collapsing at the same time. Her marriage to Ike Jones had become increasingly complicated and stressful. Her friends said that she and Ike still cared deeply for each other and that their love was real and strong. But the constant need for secrecy was grinding them both down emotionally. They couldn't be seen together in public without risking exposure of their secret, and even when they were alone together in private, there was always a sense that they were being hunted by gossip columnists, by racial prejudice, and by an entertainment industry that demanded strict conformity to its rules. The more she tried to hide her real life, the more isolated and alone she became. From a career standpoint, the good offers were becoming fewer and fewer. She had aged out of the young, innocent roles that had made her famous. But Hollywood wasn't ready to cast her as a mature leading lady in more sophisticated parts. This left her stuck in a dangerous middle ground where she was too young for mother and supporting roles, but too old for the girl-next-door parts that had built her reputation. She took whatever work she could find, sometimes accepting roles in low-budget projects that seemed far beneath her talent and experience. The work kept her busy and brought in some money, but it didn't fill the emotional void that was growing inside her. During this period, there were also strange incidents that started small but became more and more alarming as time went on. She would suddenly vanish from social events in the middle of the evening without explanation. She was seen driving alone late at night through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, as if she was running from something or trying to clear her head. Friends said that her phone calls became completely unpredictable in their tone and content. One week she might be warm and chatty, and the next week she would be abruptly distant and almost cold. One person who was particularly close to her claimed that she seemed terrified of something during this time, although she would never say exactly what was frightening her. Inger was also battling constant exhaustion that went beyond just being tired from work. Between the long hours she was putting in, the emotional strain of keeping her marriage secret, and the constant pressure to keep her real life hidden from everyone, she was slowly wearing down both physically and mentally. The people who worked with her during those last months of her life remembered moments when her carefully constructed mask would slip just a little bit. They would see a flicker of deep sadness between takes during filming, or notice an unguarded sigh before she forced herself to smile again. By early 1970, there was a definite sense among the people closest to her that something bad was coming. They couldn't name exactly what it was or when it might happen, but they could feel the tension in the air. It was thick and heavy, like the feeling you get just before a major storm breaks. That storm would indeed break one April morning, and it would create a scene so sudden and unsettling that decades later, people are still questioning the official story of what really happened. April 30th, 1970, began like any other typical day in Hollywood. The California sunlight was pouring through the palm-lined streets, and production crews were already setting up their equipment for another day of filming movies and television shows. But inside Inger Stevens' modest home in the Hollywood Hills, something had gone terribly wrong during the night or early morning hours. According to the official reports that were given to the press and the public, her roommate discovered her in the kitchen of the house, collapsed on the floor, and barely breathing. The roommate made a frantic call for help, and paramedics came racing up the winding road to her house as quickly as they could. They worked on her desperately as they sped toward the hospital in their ambulance, but their efforts were not enough to save her. At just 35 years old, Inger Stevens was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause of death, delivered with clinical swiftness by the authorities, was that she had killed herself by ingesting a toxic substance. The newspapers printed this explanation as an established fact. The public mourned the loss of a talented actress, and Hollywood quickly moved on to other news and other stories. But the details of what had happened didn't sit right with everyone who heard them. For starters, many of her friends insisted that she hadn't been spiraling into the kind of deep despair that would lead someone to take their own life. In the days leading up to her death, she had actually been making plans for the future. She had scheduled career meetings with agents and producers, made social engagements with friends, and was even considering taking a vacation to get away from the stress of Los Angeles. There was no farewell note left behind, which was unusual for someone who had supposedly planned to end their life. There was also no sign that she had been putting her personal affairs in order, which was something that people often did before taking such a drastic step. And then there was the matter of Ike Jones, her secret husband. Just hours after her death, he arrived at the hospital and quietly identified himself to the staff as her husband. This revelation completely blindsided the press and the public, who had no idea that she had been married to anyone, let alone to an African-American man in an era when such relationships were highly controversial. Their secret marriage was suddenly public knowledge, but it was being revealed under the worst possible circumstances. Almost immediately, whispers and questions began to swirl around Hollywood and in the media. Why had absolutely no one known about this marriage until that terrible moment? Why did some of the early reports about her death include odd discrepancies about exactly where in the house she was found? And why did certain personal papers and belongings from her home seem to vanish before the police could properly examine them as evidence? Some people believed that the pressure of living a double life had finally broken her emotionally, and that she had indeed chosen to end her suffering. Others suspected that something much darker had happened. They wondered if there had been interference from people who wanted her silenced for some reason, or if there had been some kind of confrontation that had gone wrong. The truth was murky and unclear, and the official explanation seemed almost too neat and simple to be believable. Even now, more than 50 years later, that April morning feels less like the end of her story, and more like the beginning of a mystery that has never been properly solved. The pieces of evidence that emerged afterward, including letters, witness testimonies, and hidden files, would only deepen the shadows and questions surrounding her final hours. For many years after her death, Inger Stevens' story was frozen in the public's mind as a tragic but relatively simple tale. She was seen as a young star who had been crushed by the enormous pressures that came with fame and success in Hollywood. But time has a way of loosening people's lips and making them more willing to speak about things they kept secret for decades. What emerged? From these later conversations would completely upend that tidy, simple narrative. Former friends, colleagues, and even one-time studio insiders began to speak more openly about what they had known or suspected at the time. One friend claimed that Inger had been receiving anonymous phone calls in the weeks before her death. These calls apparently left her visibly shaken and frightened, although she never told anyone exactly what the callers were saying to her. Another friend recalled a conversation where Inger had hinted that certain people knew too much about her private life and that she might need to disappear for a while to protect herself. Then came some very interesting documents that were unearthed by a Hollywood historian who spent years digging through old court records and property files. These papers revealed financial entanglements that placed Inger in a precarious position that nobody had known about while she was alive. There were records of large sums of money moving through bank accounts that were in her name. There were contracts that had been suddenly canceled without any clear explanation. Most unsettling of all, there was evidence that someone had been trying to gain legal control over certain parts of her estate even before she died. There were also troubling inconsistencies in the witness accounts from that morning when her body was discovered. The time when she was supposedly found, the exact location in the house where she was lying, and even the description of her physical condition varied from one person's account to another. These were details that should have been straightforward and consistent, but they seemed to shift depending on who was telling the story and when they were telling it. Ike Jones, her now revealed husband, added another twist to the mystery when he began speaking more openly about their relationship years later, while he continued to insist that her death was a personal tragedy that had nothing to do with outside forces. He also admitted that they had been planning some major changes in their lives. These were the kind of changes that might have brought their marriage into the open, whether Hollywood liked it or not. He suggested that they were getting tired of living in secrecy and were considering going public with their relationship, despite the potential consequences. Piece by piece, the simple image of a woman who was unable to cope with her problems began to fall apart. What took its place was a much murkier and more complex picture. This was a portrait of someone who was being cornered by secrets, business pressures, and perhaps forces that were far outside her control. The more these fragments of information came together, the more her final days began to look less like a surrender to despair and more like the ending of a story that someone else had been writing for her, without her knowledge or consent. When you step back and look at the timeline of events leading up to her death, the pattern that emerges is genuinely unsettling. Inger Stevens was a woman who was trying desperately to hold together two completely different lives, one for the public to see and one for herself to live. In the months before her death, both of these lives were under serious attack from different directions. The new evidence that has emerged over the years doesn't just suggest that she was suffering from stress or depression, which would be understandable given her circumstances. Instead, it points to external pressures and threats that could have been genuinely dangerous to her safety. Several of her closest friends later revealed that she had confided in them about fears of being followed and watched. This wasn't a metaphorical feeling of being under scrutiny. She meant it literally. She described seeing the same unfamiliar car parked outside her home on multiple occasions. The car was always positioned just far enough away to avoid immediate suspicion, but close enough that she noticed it repeatedly. On at least one occasion, she reportedly confronted the driver of this mysterious car, only to have him speed away without saying a word to her. Whether this person was a stalker with an obsession, a private investigator hired by someone who wanted information about her, or something even more organized and sinister, she never found out. But the repeated appearances of this car left her feeling watched and hunted in her own neighborhood. Then there was the disturbing matter of her missing belongings after her death. Certain personal items that friends swore had existed in her home simply vanished between the time her body was discovered and the time the police finished their investigation. Her personal address book disappeared, along with some private letters she had recently received. There was also a small lockbox that she had kept hidden in her bedroom closet, which several friends knew about because she had mentioned it to them. This lockbox was also gone, and it was never mentioned in any police reports. According to one person who had been particularly close to her, this lockbox contained photographs and personal documents that would have made a lot of powerful people in Hollywood very uncomfortable if they had ever been made public. The fact that these items disappeared so quickly and completely raised serious questions about who might have had access to her home and what they might have been looking for. Adding to the growing suspicion around her death, there were quiet but credible rumors about a dispute over her finances that had been going on in the months before she died. Those strange money transfers that had been discovered in the historical records might not have been voluntary transactions that she had authorized. An entertainment attorney who reviewed these financial papers many years later said that they appeared to show signs of coercion rather than willing participation. The theory that emerged was that someone in her immediate circle, or perhaps just outside it, had been trying to take advantage of her vulnerable position and her need to keep certain aspects of her life secret. And then there was the question of Ike Jones himself and his role in all of this. While some people in Hollywood tried to paint him as an opportunist who was only interested in her money and fame, many others insisted that he truly loved her and had been trying to help her break free from the system that was controlling and manipulating her. If they had decided to go public with their marriage, the backlash could have been enormous. It wouldn't have just been a social scandal. It could have been financially devastating as well, since the major studios might have blacklisted her entirely and refused to hire her for any future projects. What emerges from all of this evidence and testimony is a haunting possibility that has never been properly investigated or resolved. It's possible that Inger Stevens didn't simply succumb to the weight of her own personal struggles and choose to end her life. Instead, she may have been pushed, subtly and persistently, toward a breaking point by people who wanted to control her, silence her, or take advantage of her in some way. Whether this was accomplished through direct threats, psychological manipulation, financial pressure, or something even darker, she may have been fighting battles that no one else could see or understand. And on the day that she finally lost that fight, it's possible that someone else walked away from the situation completely untouched by consequences or justice. This possibility is what continues to haunt the people who knew her and the researchers who have spent decades trying to understand what really happened to her. In the decades since Inger Stevens' death, the official verse, "Ion of events," has been repeated so many times by so many different sources that it has become almost like folklore. The story goes that a beloved actress was worn down by the incredible pressures of working in Hollywood, and she ultimately chose to end her life rather than continue struggling with those pressures. It's a story that fits neatly into the entertainment industry's long history of tragic narratives. These are cautionary tales that warn outsiders about the price that fame can extract from a person, while simultaneously allowing the insiders who remain to quietly move on with their lives and careers. But for the people who truly knew Inger Stevens as a person, and for the small but dedicated circle of researchers who have spent years of their lives piecing together the fragments of her final days, the neat simplicity of that official ending has always felt completely wrong. The truth is that Inger Stevens didn't live her life like a victim who was passively accepting whatever happened to her. She had genuine grit, intelligence, and a keen understanding of how the Hollywood machine operated and how to navigate its complexities. She also knew how to protect herself and her interests, or at least she thought she did, which is exactly why the obvious cracks and inconsistencies in the official account of her death stand out like flashing red warning lights to anyone who looks closely enough. Consider, for example, the secrecy surrounding her marriage to Ike Jones. In 1970, an interracial marriage in Hollywood wasn't just something that was frowned upon by polite society. It was something that could be absolutely career-ending for both people involved. Yet when this marriage became public knowledge immediately after her death, it was treated by the media not as a romantic revelation or a brave act of love conquering prejudice, but as a shameful secret that might explain her emotional distress. The press at the time latched onto this interracial marriage as a possible cause for shatter, her supposed despair, which provided them with a tidy answer that conveniently distracted everyone's attention from other, much more troubling possibilities that might have required actual investigation. Then there are all those missing pieces of evidence, items and documents that simply evaporated somewhere between the time her body was discovered and the time investigators officially closed the case. Multiple friends swore that she had kept a small lockbox hidden somewhere in her home, and this box was filled with photographs and personal documents that could have been very revealing. But it was completely gone by the time anyone thought to look for it. Her personal address book vanished as well, along with certain letters that she had recently received from unknown sources. None of these missing items appeared in any police reports or evidence lists. Officially, according to the authorities, these items were never acknowledged to even exist in the first place. Over the years that followed her death, more troubling threads of information continued to emerge from various sources. There were unreleased police notes that referenced witness interviews which were conducted but never made public. Neighbors claimed they had seen unfamiliar men coming and going from her property in the days immediately before her death. One of these men was reportedly driving a dark sedan that would linger outside her house late into the night, as if someone was watching or waiting for something to happen. From within the studio system itself, there were quiet whispers suggesting that some high-level executives were actually relieved to see her various complications disappear along with her death. By complications, these sources meant her unwillingness to play the publicity games that the studios wanted her to play, and perhaps more importantly, her apparent readiness to make her controversies. I'll marriage public regardless of the consequences to her career or to the industry's carefully maintained image. One of the most disturbing details that emerged was related to her final work contracts and commitments. Within just days of her death, and before her funeral arrangements had even been finalized, at least 2 of her upcoming roles were quietly reassigned to other actresses. It was as if the entire industry had been somehow bracing for her exit from the scene, and they were ready to erase her name from their schedules and move on with their business as usual. This kind of rapid replacement doesn't usually happen unless people have advance warning that changes are coming. What remains today is a legacy that is permanently clouded by suspicion and unanswered questions. Inger Stevens's public image, the one that most people remember, was that of a bright, gentle, and talented woman whose life ended far too soon due to the pressures of fame. But the private version of her story is much darker and more complex. It's filled with unanswered questions, deliberately erased evidence, and the lingering possibility that her death was not at all what it appeared to be on the surface. That possibility is the part that haunts people the most, even after all these years. It's not just the question of how she died, but the chilling sense that the real truth has been deliberately kept out of reach by people who have something to hide. Every missing page from the official record, every conflicting account from supposed witnesses, and every sudden silence from people who should have been talking feels like another lock that has been placed on a door that someone desperately doesn't want opened. Whether it's fear, misplaced loyalty, or something far more sinister that is keeping that door firmly shut, one thing seems certain to the people who have studied this case most closely. The key to the truth still exists somewhere, and someone is still holding it. Until that person decides to step forward, or until that key is found through some other means, the real story of what happened to Inger Stevens will remain one of Hollywood's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The question that continues to echo through the decades is not just what happened to her, but why so many people seem determined to make sure that the world never finds out the complete truth.